Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LTA playoffs round number 1 quarterfinals overview and analysis video. It is time for cross-conference. It is time for the top 4 teams from the LTA North and the top 4 teams from the LTA South to come together and see who is going to be the team that wins this tournament and moves on to represent the League of the Americas at first stand at the big international tournament here for the winter split. It's all cross-region matchups here in round number 1. The number 1 seed taking on the number 4 seed, the number 2 seed taking on the number 3 seed from the opposite region. So very excited to get into it. If you guys are excited, let me know down in the comment section below. Of course, there is definitely a narrative that we're going to be walking out of this video with. I think that there is definitely kind of a clear-cut narrative in terms of how things ended up going in the quarterfinals here, but we'll talk about that throughout the video. Of course, we'll cover everything. We'll cover all 4 series, and we'll be going in depth. So again, just let me know if everything lived up to your expectations, if you expected the results that ended up happening, or if you were surprised by how things ended up going down. Obviously, I'll share mine, but if you want to know my thoughts, I have covered the LTA North all year up until this point, every single game for them. That playlist is going to be up in the iCard. I've not covered the South on this channel. I'm stacked enough as it is in terms of the videos that we are putting out for the other major regions. Unfortunately, the South is just not on the priority list for being able to make content because I haven't been making content on it the past couple of years, but I did go back and watch every playoff game, so I am familiar with these teams just as I would be for the LTA North teams. I just haven't made videos on them. So I promise I am going to give you some breakdowns of what I expected and whether or not these teams lived up to it, but let's go ahead and get right into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go series by series in the quarterfinals, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each series that we cover, and at the end of the video, of course, we will be talking about the semifinals and the 4 teams that are remaining, which I think are in a good position to be able to push to maybe win the entire tournament and go to first stand, and which I think are definitely going to need some better performances than what they showed in round number 1 in the quarterfinals. But again, most of today is just going to be spent talking about the quarterfinals, talking about these first matchups, and again, there is quite a bit to talk about, especially narrative-wise going into this. So without further ado, let's jump into our first series. It's going to be kicking off with the number 1 seed from the LTA North, taking on the number 4 seed from the LTA South, that of course being the number 1 seed 100 Thieves and the number 4 seed Pain Gaming. And 100 Thieves is pretty predictably going to take the 2-0 to start off the quarterfinals. This is not an upset under any circumstances. Not only were the LTA North teams already pretty big favorites coming into today, but at the same time, like, Pain has not looked particularly consistent throughout the LTA South already. We're not seeing that same version of this team that we saw at Worlds last year, although I think there are some pieces that are relatively similar playstyle-wise. They rely so much on Titan in the bot lane to kind of be the best player on the Rift, to be able to keep them relevant in a lot of these games, and to be able to outskill the opposition. He is so aggro, he is so greedy in terms of the plays that he wants to go for, that he is going to generate advantages for his team that other players just aren't. But on the flip side, if he's losing 1v1 skill duels against the other AD carry, that's going to be a bit of a problem, and that's exactly what ended up happening in this series. 100 Thieves continue their hot streak here by picking up yet another win. They have yet to drop a series in 2025, and this is obviously a continuation of that. This team is still clicking on every cylinder, and it's mostly because of their new offseason addition, that being FBI in the bot lane, who is going to get player of the series. He once again played phenomenally throughout both of these games, specifically in game number 2, where it felt like he was super relevant towards the success, ends up out-dueling the Ezreal on the Kai'Sa later on in a 1v1 late in the game. That really kind of changes things for Pain. It kind of shows that, you know, Titan, while he is in a decent spot to be able to generate resources, might not be able to capitalize as well as the other team, and that is exactly what happened. There are criticisms, I think, generally with this team, 100 Thieves that is, mostly that their macro is still kind of up and down. Like, they definitely aren't the most consistent team in the world. I think you can look at game number 2 in particular for this, but game number 1 was still one of those games where it felt like it should have been easier for them. They just kept making bad decisions or allowing Pain to get back into the game in certain situations that they shouldn't. Overall, it just wasn't the cleanest performance in the world, and that's kind of what you want to see, but the individual skill level of the players on this team is clear, and it's very easy to see that this is going to be a problem for especially LTA South teams to deal with. FBI is a major upgrade in the bot lane, even over someone like Tomo, who was decent for this team last year. Like, he wasn't the problem. He came in and actually stabilized this team, I would say. For the most part, was definitely better than Meech, in my opinion, coming in and really kind of getting 100 Thieves across the border and getting them to Worlds. FBI has come in and completely upgraded the floor floor and the ceiling of this team. I've always been a big FBI believer on this channel. In fact, I've gotten quite a bit of criticism over the last couple of years because of how much of an FBI defender and an FBI believer I have been, generally speaking, and so it's nice to see him finally start to get the recognition he deserves as a player that is really good in basically every aspect of the game. He came into the league as a very good laner and a bad team fighter. He has really grown into being a very good team fighter and a very consistent carry in the back half of games, and now he's just terrifying to play. Like, he doesn't have the highest mechanical ceiling in the world in comparison to like what someone like Berserker was in the LCS, you know, last year, but he is about as good as you're going to get at the North American level, and he is definitely somebody that raises what you can expect from 100 Thieves. He's really stabilized with Ayla down in the support position. I've liked Ayla before. I think his tape at times has looked really good. He's just been super inconsistent. I think getting that chemistry with FBI has been absolutely massive, and he has been really good to start the year. Quid is obviously somebody I don't even really need to go too far into. I've been singing this guy's praises for over a year at this point. You know, I was critical of the signing, and I was critical of him in 2023 summer, but basically 2024 spring onwards, I have been all aboard the Quid train, and he continued to completely gap his lane opponent in this one. River, I think, has been solid. Sniper, I think, has been even better than he was last year, where I thought he really kind of trailed off down the stretch. It feels like he's starting to get some of that like spring 2024 spring form back, even if it's not entirely there yet. His laning stats are still quite poor, but overall 100 Thieves just have multiple ways they can win games. Quid and FBI are terrifying as a double carry duo. Ayla and River have been excellent facilitative pieces, and even if their macro isn't perfect, they obviously have shown like just a mechanical difference in terms of what they're able to accomplish versus the teams against them. Their leads are ginormous, and they're good at executing in the late game. They're not the flashiest team in the world, but they certainly are one of the more fun ones to watch. And then for Pain Gaming, again, this was kind of the expected outcome. I don't think anybody really gave them a huge shot in this series. It would have been a pretty big upset if they came out on top. I think everybody kind of lived up to the expectations in terms of playstyle. Titan was crazy aggro, was willing to try and trade 1v1, and was willing to try and take a lot of these skirmishes, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Curry wasn't really able to keep up with that. Karayuka is fine. Like, the Ivern actually caused people to go crazy on 100 Thieves in game number 2. The dude pressed stopwatch, and it reminded everybody in the entire game that stopwatch was an item, and so they all bought it. It was very funny stuff. The Ivern, just full committing onto the Ivern every single fight was a massive disaster from 100 Thieves, but they still were able to win it because they were so far ahead and they are so much better in team fights than Pain. It's just one of those things. I don't blame Karayuka for that. I think he's fine. Like, he played these games about as well as he could, especially game number 2, generally speaking. Weiser was basically irrelevant, I'll just say, over the course of these games, but dud of the series for me, it's pretty obviously going to go to Dinkedo in the mid lane. I just did not feel like he played particularly well. Quid was definitely the better of these two mid laners in both of these games, but game number 1 I think stood out even more in that regard. I'm pretty anti-Corki in the mid lane right now. We talk about it a lot in the LCK because it's just not working there, but you need to be able to skirmish early, and if it's like Corki into Yone, good luck, man. good luck winning a 3v3 around Void Grubs when you have Corki there. It's just not going to happen. It's not a particularly good situation. I think you can play him in the bot lane if you do want that, like, you know, decent laner, good scaler, like good in team fights. Like, Corki can still be very relevant. I think his damage numbers are solid, and he is a good late game out. I just think in the mid lane right now, it's very difficult to rely on that, and going Corki and then Azir into a team that's kind of notorious for playing really aggro through the middle of the map, not really a call I would have made, so Dinkedo is going to get my dud of the series. But again, I'm not shocked by this outcome for Pain Gaming. This is basically what they showed in the LTA South tournament, is that they are very aggressive, they're going to be pretty risky, but they just don't necessarily have the skill level to be able to back that up, especially outside of Titan in the bot lane, who is kind of their one driving force, in my opinion. So not a shocker, not a surprise, but Pain Gaming is unfortunately eliminated here in 2 games, and 100 Thieves will be moving on to the semifinals. We'll see if they can keep their good form up. Obviously, it's looked phenomenal so far. Yeah, I kind of am wondering if this team is going to crash back down to earth. I still don't know if they're my favorites to come out of this tournament as victors, because I just think that there are some higher upside teams, even if this team has looked the best so far in 2025. I really like what they're doing, but I still need to be proven that their weird engage habits, their weird macro decisions, they're not going to come back to bite them against teams that actually know what they're doing. For now, it's definitely good enough to be able to overcome teams they're definitely better than, but I think it gets harder from here. But then moving on to our second of these quarterfinals matchups, and this one was seeding-wise in favor of the LTA South, but unfortunately, the result was the same. It was the number 2 seed from the LTA South and Leviatan taking on the number 3 seed from the LTA North in FlyQuest. Thank you to the people who posted in the comment section that they were prominently involved in the Valorant scene. That obviously helps out a lot in terms of English pronunciation. So Leviatan, I understand that that is how you properly pronounce it now when I asked in the previous video. So Thank you once again to the people who commented that, but let's go ahead and talk about the games themselves, because FlyQuest is going to be taking the 2-0 win here. They are going to be dominating 2-0. Once again, very similar to what we saw in the first series, and again, this is kind of the expected outcome, even though FlyQuest are technically the lower seed here, even though they're coming in as the number 3 seed. A lot of people still look at them like potentially the number 1 team to come out of the LTA North, that they are probably the team with the highest upside in the LTA North, and that's kind of what they showed off here, a lot more of what they showed off at the end of 2024 rather than the beginning of 2025. It has kind of felt like they are trolling a bit in terms of their matchups so far. I think obviously this team is very greedy. They are very, very cocky in terms of the way that they approach the game. Whippo has gone on to say things like, we don't even scout like the enemy teams that we're playing. We just play our style, and just kind of, right before the game, I'll get an idea of what my laner, plays. But outside of that, like, I don't know, like, I don't care too much about the team that we're playing into. I think that that's something that obviously I would expect would hold them back moving forward, and I do think it's been a bit, maybe you can attribute some of their flaws at the beginning of the year to that mentality, but at the end of the day, they're probably the most mechanically talented team in the entirety of the LTA, and so for them to come out on top, it's not shocking. And then for Leviatan, they were exciting for me going into this tournament. Them and Isurus were definitely the 2 teams I was most looking forward to. Isurus just because I feel like they had the most well-rounded team, and we'll talk about them a bit later, but Leviatan mostly for Cody, who was really exciting for me. He's a player that I had liked a couple of years ago and talked about him when he went to MSI, and, kind of hyped him up there, and I feel like he's gotten even better. Going back and watching the tape, he was probably the best player in the LTA South. Reminded me a lot of like what Quid was in the LTA North, and that made me excited to see what he could be going up against Quad, but boy, did that not turn out all that well. So let's go ahead and go over it. Quad is going to get player of the series for me. I think this has to go to either him or Inspired. It should go to somebody in the middle of the map, but the Mel and the Corki, I think both ended up really being problems for Leviatan to actually deal with. They didn't really have clean answers to that. I really don't like Azir as an answer to Corki. I think I can understand the idea behind like saying screw it, like we just want to scale into the late game as well, and generally speaking, it does feel like teams are a bit obsessed right now with both Corki and Azir, but Corki is like a free invitation to pick something that just dominates early and can skirmish in the 3v3 to be able to shut him down, and for Lev not to take that in any circumstance is definitely frustrating. I definitely am a bit like, I didn't love Cody's decision-making in that front, and then obviously allowing Mel in game number 1. I've talked about Mel a lot on the channel already, maybe not like a ton, but we've talked about her in the LCK as well as the LEC, and I will continue to say what I have said there. I think the higher you get in skill level, the less Mel is going to be as immediately effective, but if you are like way better than the team that you're playing into, Mel is going to be almost impossible to deal with, and that's kind of what we saw here. Quad was the most relevant player on the Rift, and then of course he was really good on the Corki in game number 2. Quad just with another really solid series. Again, I think I've somehow developed a reputation of being a Quad hater. I say somehow. I do understand why I've gotten that reputation, but I don't think it's fair for me to say that he's anything other than a top 2 mid laner in North America right now. I think that that is exactly where he lands, and that's how he performed here. Inspired goes deathless across this whole series, was certainly more relevant in the back half of game number 2 than the Nidalee, than Scary on the other side of this matchup, but Inspired starting to get some of that form back. I don't think he was really all that good in the LTA North. At least I don't think he was like living up to the expectations of being the number 1 player in the region like we had him graded going into 2025. He was just okay for FlyQuest, but if he can get that form back, if he can be the MVP caliber player, kind of like he was in this series, then things are definitely going to open up. I think people are looking at Busio because he ended up playing Pyke in game number 2, and boy, was this an NA Pyke. Like, we're kind of notorious for not playing this champion all that well, and this was indicative of that. This was not really that great of a Pyke game coming out from him, but he was still more relevant than most of the other players on the other side of this matchup. I'm not even really blaming Busio all that much. He's never been a particularly good Pyke player, but he got to play signature champ in Rakan in game 1, so I can give him a bit of a pass. Masu's been great to start the year. I think he's, basically picked up right where he left off at Worlds. Bwippo's been fine, solid. He's been Bwippo. Like, he was definitely the better top laner here, but it was the middle of the map that definitely stood out, and that's, I think, why it's so frustrating for Lev, because I think Cody was their driving force. He was so important towards their success in the LTA South, and he just got obliterated here. He is the easy choice for dud of the series on the Azir in particular in game number 2. He just did not play well. He was constantly getting outlaned and outroamed by Quad, and it just didn't feel like he had the ability to be able to keep up with the player of Quad skill level, which is terrifying for Leviatan, because if that's not even on the plate, like if it's not even in the realm of possibility for Cody to be on the same level as Quad, I really don't think this team can do all that much. Like, I can't stress enough just how relevant he was towards their success domestically, and for him to be so bad in this series and feel like he's not even on the same tier as the other mid laner, like, that just goes to show that this team might not have what it takes to be able to compete with a team like FlyQuest from a mechanical standpoint. They have experienced players like Seo have been, to international tournaments very regularly. Zothva, I think, has been to international tournaments before. Pro Delta and Scary aren't exactly bad players, but Cody is supposed to be the driving force on this team, and if not Cody, then Seo needs to do something, and neither of them really stepped up, and both of them were quite bad in particular in this series. Scary's scoreline looks good. Most of that is the early game on Nidalee, where the rest of the game just ended up being very irrelevant. Zothva was definitely worse than Bwipo. Pro Delta didn't get to do anything. The engages weren't there. The Braum was kind of useless going into the Pike in game number 2. Just overall, not a particularly good series for Leviatan. I think they are a talented team, and I imagine they will continue to do well domestically, but we are seeing the flaws of a team that relies on a player that needs to be like the most mechanically talented player on the Rift. When that's not the case, when that's not really going to work out, like, Fly is just going to be able to run them over, and that's what happened here. Fly is still a very good team, and, with the sides of the bracket, with the way that things are going, there is like a real shot that this team absolutely does go on to win this entire tournament, and I think a lot of people, me included, are kind of still considering them favorites, regardless of how they played in the LTA North. This kind of backs that up. Quad is playing really well right now. I think Masu is also playing really well right now. If you can get MVP inspired out, that's probably the best team in the entire tournament. But then moving on to our third quarterfinals matchup, and we're flipping it over. It's still a 2-3 match, but this time the roles are reversed. It's the number 2 seed from the LTA North in Cloud9, taking on the number 3 seed from the LTA South in Loud. And Cloud9 is also going to pick up the 2-0 win. Team Liquid, the only thing standing in the way from North America going 8-0 in the quarterfinals right now. Obviously, this was a result that a lot of us expected. I think that it was pretty clear that North America was just going to be better than a lot of the LTA South teams. It's super unfortunate. I will use this segment to talk a little bit about the format, because honestly, there's just not a lot of game to talk about for this one. This was probably the least close of all 3 series. Cloud9 obliterated Loud, and I do think that this format does encourage some really negative things. We already talked about the negatives domestically, but there are some negatives cross-conference wise that I think are going to be everlasting between these 2 regions, just generally speaking, both the North and the South, including the LLA, right? We'll talk about that as well. But for Loud, like, I'm sorry, you're just not as good as Cloud9. That was always going to be the case. This was already a team that was, up and down, we'll just say, domestically. I think that their carry duo was okay. Tinones and Route, I think, are okay players. Root, I think, is technically how you pronounce it, but I've called him Route on this channel, so I'll try to start fixing that. But Root was fine. Tinones was fine. Like, they weren't the problem here. Wiz was, I guess, okay. Even Winsome, like, his scoreline looks bad, but it was whatever. It's just such a clear talent gap, right? Like, this is not even a remotely close series, and I'll quickly touch upon it. Player of the series is going to go to Sven for me. I'm a big Sven believer. Like, I've started to see people really doubt him, and I think a lot of that comes from the stats, comes from the fact that he doesn't necessarily have the greatest CSD at 15. He doesn't necessarily have the greatest GD at 15. DPM has not ever been near the highest of the league for Sven, but I think he fills his role on this team so well, and I think we've seen what he can be when he is like a primary option for a team like Dignitas last year, where he still is the player that can show up and dominate in situations. He just doesn't have to do that, and I think he does take a lot more of a passive approach on Cloud9. Would you like to see him win lane a little bit more dominantly? Maybe, but overall, like, I'm still a Sven defender. I think if you brought him onto your team and put him in the right circumstance, he can give you top 1, top 2 AD carry output, and even if he's not going to necessarily do that on Cloud9, mostly because of the role he's been given, he's still a very consistent team fighter, and he definitely takes advantage of players that are not as good as him on the other side, which is exactly what Loud is, unfortunately, right now. So nice series overall from Sven and from Vulcan, both of them getting obscenities thrown at them basically the entire game. Not that that's shocking or a problem. Like, I want to make it clear, I'm not trying to say anything about the Brazilian community. Like, that's part of why the Brazilian community is so beloved. It's because of how passionate they are. I guess my point is that Sven and Vulcan didn't really care. Like, they just didn't really, it didn't phase them all that much, even in the post-game interview, but they were good. Blabber ends up getting a victory on Vi. That's something he doesn't do all that much domestically, so it's nice to see him come out to this tournament and do it. Thanatos was way better than Robo on the other side of this. Thanatos is really starting to emerge as a player I believe in at this level. Loki has been exactly what this team has asked him to be. I think champions like Talia are going to be super common for Cloud9 for the rest of the year, because that plays into the style that they want to have, where they want Loki moving around the map to play for Blabber, and and really try to get him ahead so that they can translate that to either top or bot lane for the mid and late game. Generally, this was just a Cloud9 win. Like, they were the better team, specifically in game 2. It really felt like it was never particularly close, and a lot of that just comes down to the individual differences that C9 is able to generate, but this is still a team that can win this entire tournament. Again, very similar to Fly. I think Fly and Cloud9 right now, alongside 100 Thieves, are the favorites, right? Like, we've seen the 3 favorites, play already, and Cloud9 kind of lived up to that expectation, maybe even the most so far. And then for Loud on the other side, kind of the expected outcome. They were never going to be able to go into Cloud9 and be able to hold their own mechanically. I think we all kind of knew that that was coming. That wasn't really the case internationally, so I didn't really see why it was going to be the case domestically. I liked their addition of Winsome, and I think generally this bot lane has been the strength of this team. Tinones is super consistent. In the middle of the map reminds me a ton of like Prime Larson in terms of the way he plays the game, but there's still just too many flaws. Robo ends up being way too aggro and getting caught out in some bad situations. He's going to get done of the series. This has always been a Robo thing. He is a very feast or famine top laner. I loved talking about him at 2022 Worlds, and, going beyond that, like, he has shown a lot of good things internationally. We know that the high-end performance from him is really good, but the low-end is not particularly good, and that's what we saw here. Thanatos was just better. Wiz is just wholly unimpressive as a facilitative jungler. I just wasn't really all that interested here. And then even Root and Winsome, like, they were kind of running it at times here. Tinones didn't do anything in the middle of the map. Like, Loud just wasn't on the same level as Cloud9, and that became abundantly clear. But I'm going to use the rest of this time to talk about the format and talk about just how demoralizing this has to be for LTA South fans, for CB LOL fans, for Brazilian fans and Latin American fans, where, throughout all of League's history, you've had your own little playground to be able to have these, domestic rivalries and to be able to, I don't want to say trick yourselves, but like genuinely like see a performance domestically and believe that you can compete on the international stage. And now it just feels like that has been snuffed away from you, not only because you're not going to be going to first stand because, I'm not spoiling anything for the last series, but even if, a team like Isurus ends up winning, I just don't see them winning this tournament. It would be a gigantic upset for any of the LTA South teams to ever win a cross-conference tournament against North America. Not only are you not going to be going to an international tournament like this, but like your only actual like playoff coverage for the entire year is one best of 3 where you get slaughtered by an LTA North team. Like these teams aren't going to get better. These teams aren't going to evolve and improve. They're playing 3 games at most and getting eliminated from the playoffs. Like, I just don't know what this system is for. I don't know who it's for. You have North American teams traveling to Brazil to decimate their teams in front of their home crowds, demoralizing the crowds, getting the LTA North players, I guess the best way to say would be like, thrown obscenities at, like people getting your LTA players in front of these hostile crowds that are going to be very, against them. And you also have these players in the LTA North that don't care all that much about these series because they are so much better than Loud. They're not getting better from these series. It just feels like a lose-lose, like across the board. Every region loses from this. North America loses because they're not actually getting competition and they have to fly across the entire, to a different continent in order to slaughter teams that they're better than in front of their home crowds. You have Brazilian teams that aren't good enough to be able to compete and are just immediately out of tournaments that don't even really allow them to get better. Like, it just is such a weird format that I think really hurts everyone involved, and this was a great example of that. Loud is not going to get a chance to be able to play against LTA North teams and get better over the course of this year, try to get to their level. And LTA North teams like Cloud9, they don't get better from playing Loud. Like, they don't have to try to beat Loud. It just kind of is what it is right now. It just feels like a really bad situation and a really bad format. Let me know if you agree or disagree with that down in the comments. I know some people have defended this format down in the comments. I'm always curious to hear other opinions. I'm definitely willing to hear some positives, but it just feels like these games don't matter, and for it to be like the playoffs and for games to feel predetermined and for an entire region at this point in the LTA South to feel like they have no shot at being able to compete cross-conference, it just feels like, what's the point? Like, it's never going to get better. Now, to be fair to this format choice, to be fair to the selection of this in the first place, I don't think that Riot initially predicted that the LTA North was going to be so top-heavy in terms of how much better their good teams are than their bad teams, where the top 4 are actually all just really solid, and you could argue there's a 5th team in Dignitas that's looked okay, but the bottom 4, or bottom 3, if you want to say that, are just not very good, and I think they would individually struggle against some of these Brazilian teams. And also, when you look at the LTA South, it's a league with significantly more more parity. You don't have that top-heavy team at the top. As much as I liked teams like Leviatan and Isurus Estral coming into this tournament, they were not like that much better than everybody else. It feels like the LTA South is a lot more competitive across the board, which does unfortunately mean that they're probably not going to be able to take down the teams that are just better from North America. You don't have that one team that's really standing out above everybody else. Like, the configuration of how these teams have come together has definitely hurt them in the long run, but still, like, this was always going to be a problem. This was always going to be a concern. And with North American teams like starting to retain a lot of the top talent that they use over the course of the last few years, with you have a team like completely returning from a quarterfinals appearance where they almost took down Gen G, etc., right? Like, North America is just kind of growing at the top and like shrinking at the bottom, and that still is something that is going to hurt the LTA South in the long run. So I just generally don't really like this format. I think it helps basically no one. I don't think either region, either nation ends up actually benefiting from this in any meaningful way, and we just get another situation where, a team like Cloud9 just cruises to a victory. So there's your rant for the video. Loud is out, and that was kind of predictable. They looked pretty good in the final weekend of the LTA South, but outside of that, this was a predictable outcome. Cloud9 is a genuinely good team, and they are a team that's going to compete to go to first stand. If you want an outlook on the rest of this tournament, I absolutely think this team is good enough for them to be able to win the finals. Very similar to what I said about FlyQuest. If you had to ask me right now, I would actually argue that Fly and Cloud9 are probably the two teams I'm expecting the most to be able to take that finals. And I know that's maybe disrespectful to 100 Thieves, but that's just how highly I view where Cloud9 is at right now, and I think this series was another good example of that. But that's going to bring us to our fourth and final series of the video, our fourth and final series of the quarterfinals. Can the LTA South actually pick up a series? When can they get a single team into the semifinals? Well, this is their best chance. This is their number 1 seed taking on the number 4 seed from the LTA North. It's Isurus Estral taking on Team Liquid. And Team Liquid is going to pick up the win. This time, though, it is a 2-1. At least IE did pick up a game win in game number 2. Now, how much of that was Umpty just completely running it down and losing the game individually for Liquid? I think that's up to your own individual interpretation, but at the end of the day, if it hasn't become clear, this format is just not fair for the LTA South teams. It's never going to be a fair format for them. If you're having your best team pretty handily get beat by the 4th best team from the other side of this conference, it's just not a good format. Like, it's not a good setup for the LTA South to ever do it. Already went on the rant. I'm not going to go into it even more. We can just talk about the game here, because I do think there is more to talk about with this series, and there has been a lot of the other ones that we've talked about. Most notably, like, player of the series. I don't think a lot of people are talking about this because Umpty was quite bad. Bertle had a couple of really head-scratching moments in game number 3, and I think it did cloud a lot of the good things that actually came out of this series, but holy crap, was Jan incredible in these 3 games. He was so good, especially in game 3. The dude was unbelievable. This was the best performance of the week individually from any player, I would argue. And I'm really excited to be able to say that. I wasn't starting to get concerned. That's not really something that I want to say about Jan and Core as a bot lane, but they were so far and away, in my opinion, the number 1 bot lane in North America last year, and they haven't quite been that so far in 2025. FBI and Ayla have been great. I think Sven and Vulcan are really excellent. Masu and Busio have obviously taken that next leap. It wasn't quite clear to me that Jan and Core were that clear-cut number 1 in the same way that they were last year. But this is, the Jan that we needed to come out and see, the kind of guy who can absolutely take over even when the rest of his teammates are kind of trolling. Umpty was trolling throughout a lot of this series. Obviously, the Poppy game was awful in game 2, but the Skarner wasn't like a ton better in game 3. I don't think Impact played phenomenal on the top side, even if I do think that, he wasn't that much of a problem. And, Core had a couple of good moments, but overall, I think the engages were lacking in a couple of key areas. Now, AP was playing really well in the mid lane. I think this has been maybe his best series of the entire year up until this point. I was actually very, very positive on his gameplay against Mireu, a player who I do rate pretty highly in the mid lane for Isurus Estral, but Jan was the guy for Team Liquid. And if this team is going to rise above where they are right now, which to me is kind of clearly the 4th best team in North America, if they're going to rise above that, it's going to be through the bot lane. It's always going to be through the bot lane when it comes to this team. So really nice to see them show up and be the big game breakers. Like I said, APA I thought was really good in this series. I thought the general tape looked very solid, even in lane where he generally struggles, and I thought Mireu would actually be able to take advantage of that because he is such a good laner, but Nope, APA is just better, but Dud of the Series is actually going to stay on the winning side in this matchup. It's going to stay on Umti in the jungle. He's had a really bad start to the year, man. I know I've been an Umti hater on this channel, and that does look really good right now. Like, it's aged really well, but I honestly kind of feel bad because it's kind of swung, I think, too far in the opposite direction, where I like his personality a lot, and there was a lot of reasons why people were high on him as a player, because they liked that he brought what he brought to the LCS last year, this aggressive style coming from the LCK. He was a very early game focused jungler, and in those circumstances he can create a lot of highlight plays, but he just isn't the most consistent player in the universe. Unfortunately now, like, his late game problems are becoming more and more apparent, more and more obvious, and they're not being covered up nearly as much as they were last year because Impact's not dominating on the top side and getting these gigantic leads 1v1. You know, top and bot were both up, 1k gold individually at 10 minutes every single game last year domestically, and so Umti didn't just have to do all that much in the early game. He just kind of had to coast off of it. Now that he has to do a little bit more, at least in the early game, it's definitely not working out for him. It's definitely not been a really good start to 2025. Hopefully he can turn things around, but he almost lost them the series, and he's getting Dud of the Series for it. I think he was the worst player on the Rift. He just happened to be playing for the better team, and that was Yon and APA in particular. Core to a lesser extent, and Impact was fine. Like, I'm not trying to fully criticize all 4 of the other players on Team Liquid, but Umti was like a problem here. He continues to be a bit of an issue, but overall, you live with that for Team Liquid because you were able to come out on top. Unfortunately, you don't get the undefeated North American 8-0 sweep that I think the region was kind of looking for, but I think they will take 8-1. I don't think that's going to be too big of a consolation prize. And then for Isurus Estral on the other side, like, this was probably the best shot that the LTA South had. I do think on paper this is probably the best team in the LTA South, although, like I said, that region is much more homogenized and, like, close than I would say North America is, where it's pretty clear what the upper half of North America looks like. And in the LTA South, I do think that it's a lot more open-ended as a conversation. I think you could talk about all 4 teams at this tournament being in the conversation. Red Canids weren't even here at this tournament, and so, like, there are options. There are actual teams out there that I think, could make some noise, but generally speaking, Isurus Estral was considered the team to beat going in, and yeah, they took a game. I think they're going to be happy about that, but they have their own individual flaws. A lot of people are going to want to give Dud of the Series to Bertle on the top side. Bertle's a big reason why I'm high on this team in the first place. I'm a notorious Bertle defender on this channel. I think he's been a lot better over the past couple of years than people give him credit for. He was okay on Sandbox, certainly wasn't bad. He was actually really good in the spring split of that 2023 year when he was on Sandbox, and then I thought he was a big reason why LGD overperformed so much last year. To come over to LTA South and, like, to immediately win it, to be the #1 team going into playoffs, that's kind of what you would have expected from a player of Bertle's caliber. He is still somebody that I feel good about, even if he wasn't very good here. I'm more concerned about Mireyu because the way he lost was a lot more, like, it wasn't, like, Bertle lost to splash plays that were bad, as he almost always does, just being way too greedy on the top side. Mireyu just got outplayed by APA in lane. That's, like, unacceptable. That is a really big disaster, and he is a player that is way too important towards this team for that to happen. Snacker and Ackerman, I think, are fine as a bot lane, but they're certainly not the strength of this team, and Yon and Core definitely took advantage of that. Ackerman in particular wasn't great. And then Jose Deodo, we know who he is as a player. He's going to be around mid-table when it comes to, like, the LTA North, and so to take on someone like Umti, even with Umti really struggling, he wasn't able to make the most of it, although I will say Ivern generally looked very good across all rounds of the quarterfinals in this tournament, so we'll see if that continues onwards. But for Isurus Estral, I do think they still are the best chance that the LTA South has of creating a team that can end up competing with the teams from the LTA North. It just wasn't the case here. They are able to win a game, though, and that is the positive takeaway for Team Liquid. A ton of stuff to clean up, like, genuinely a ton of things to clean up. I think they're the weakest team from North America at this tournament. Personally, right now, I feel like there is a clear-cut top 3, and Team Liquid's not quite there in terms of the consistency they've offered so far. They have the talent to get there. Yon and Core could be the best players at this entire tournament. I think that that's an entirely fair thing to expect. It's just been kind of the rest of the team that I'm concerned about. Umti in particular has just had a horrific start to 2025, and he is a very streaky player, so maybe it's just a bad streak right now, but if Team Liquid can just have 2 back-to-back series that are positive, they absolutely can still walk out of this tournament as winners. All right, but that is going to do it for my LTA Winter Playoffs Quarterfinals overview and analysis video. Up on the screen, the updated bracket after the quarterfinals. We now know our semifinals matchups. Of course, kind of rare to just have, like, a straight-up single elimination 8-person bracket in modern League of Legends. You don't really get a lot of these, but we are going to be getting closer to the 1 best-of-5 that it takes to actually qualify you for an international tournament coming out of the LTA. Somehow, some way, these semifinals are still best of 3s. I don't know how we're getting away with that. I don't know how these aren't best of fives at this point. It genuinely feels ridiculous, the format in general, but it's all North American teams, as we know, as we've talked about already in this video. Let's quickly preview what I'm expecting from these two series, starting with 100 Thieves taking on FlyQuest. I think this is definitely the more intriguing of the two on paper for me, because I think these are kind of in the upper echelon of teams right now in the LTA. I'm going to kind of go against the grain here. I think FlyQuest is the better team. I think they have taken some time to ramp up and get ready, but I do think Quad into Quid is like a generally neutralizing matchup, and I think that Quid might not be able to get the same kind of advantages he's gotten against a lot of other teams. And, you know, FBI is a good player, but Masu and Busio, again, are also very good at playing weak side. If they just need to take like a little bit more of a back seat, and you just have Whippo capitalizing on Sniper, and you have Inspired just being a better jungler than River, in my opinion, that's where I think FlyQuest should theoretically just be the better of these two teams, and that's why I would expect them to move on. But 100 Thieves are in better form, and if Quid and FBI get rolling, if those two can actually like carry a game or two, you know, then yeah, like things get out of control really fast. They could be the best players on the Rift, especially with the form that they're in. So I think this is definitely the more intriguing of the first two semifinals matchups, but I'm still going to predict FlyQuest to be moving forward. And then for Team Liquid taking on Cloud9, this one is much easier in terms of predictions. Cloud9 should be the better of these two teams. I don't think Team Liquid looks particularly good right now. Looks like a very exploitable part of the team, and generally speaking, like, I don't know, APA is not the most aggressive player in the world. Impact has not carried over that 2024 form. I've said this a lot about Impact, but I'm going to say it once again. His first year on every new team is awesome, and then it just gets worse from there. It's weird how that's kind of just been like a running trend with him. The first year he's on a new org always looks so good, and it never looks as good in year two, and that is unfortunately how winter has started for him. But we have to remember, Team Liquid didn't really look all that good in spring of last year either until the playoffs. They got their shit together in the best of fives, and they were able to move on, win the finals, kind of shock everybody, and go to MSI. Theoretically, something like that could happen. They have enough talent to be able to level up, and Yon and Course could still be the best bot lane left at this tournament, and that could definitely be an advantage for Liquid. But for now, I trust Cloud9 a bit more, especially because I think Blabber into Umti is a very Cloud9 favored matchup. So I'm picking FlyQuest, and I'm picking Cloud9 to move on to the finals. Let me know if you agree or disagree with that down in the comments section below. But that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we'll be covering the rest of the LTA playoffs, but we cover all three of the other major regions as well, LEC, LCK, and LPL. All of them have their playoffs going right now. Well, I guess LPL starts up very shortly, but we've covered all of the other regions' playoffs already this week, and we'll be covering it even more later on in the week. So if you're interested in that stuff, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all